Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about Autechre and their 9th album, Quaristice. Yeah, I got the CD of this one, shit just got real. So, this one might have thrown me off a little bit. I don't think there's a particularly strong consensus on this one when it comes to the hardcore Autechre fans. Seems to be held in less high regard than their last several projects of theirs, I guess. I, however, as I've said before, do not consider myself a hardcore fan of this duo. I remember long ago that Quaristice was actually one of the first projects of theirs I ever heard. It was either the second or the third project I heard from them, I can't remember exactly, but going into it, I think I was at least familiar with Autechre's reputation as a heady and difficult band that were a bit too far out there for some people to wrap their heads around easily. This one stuck out to me as a possible way to get myself into them, and it might have stuck out to me A, because it was their most popular project on iTunes at the time, and B, the album cover sticks out like a sore thumb among all their other releases. In contrast to all their other covers, which have very muted or gray color schemes that aren't very appealing, you got this one, which is a significantly more eye-catching bright blue. And you'd think this would seriously be a weird one to jump to after Amber, but I don't know. For whatever reason, I always had an easier time getting into this than most of their other projects. Probably because of the more abundant appearance of straight ambient tracks, that probably added a lot. The project did feel like it had a pretty cool atmosphere to it that could form in spite of feeling pretty weird and jumbled and all over the place. I had good enough memories of this project being one of the projects from these guys that actually consistently clicked for me that I obviously sprung for the CD. My previous marathons of these guys always highlighted this project as the end of the so-called difficult period in their catalog that ran from Chiastic Slide to Untilted and had mostly albums that would throw me off and need quite a lot of time to grow on me. But this one always felt more welcoming to outsiders like myself. I thought it was safe to take a break from these guys and spend a few days with Caribou's catalog and that new Fortet album and then ease myself back in with this project. But that might have been a mistake. First return listen, I couldn't make heads or tails of this project at all and wondered if I was crazy for holding this project up in higher regard before. I mean, to be fair, I'm not really sure what I was expecting. Fun fact, Autechre is not Fortet. In comparison to an artist like him, even these guys' most accessible releases need air quotes around that word. But with more repeat listens and refamiliarizing myself with the project, my old opinions started to come back. Given how this is one of the projects that helped me warm up to this duo originally, I feel more inclined to defend it. I certainly don't think it's a flawless masterpiece, and I don't think I ever did, but it's always been a more personal favorite than other ones of theirs. It's still definitely in the upper tier of my ranking. I mean, one thing you definitely can't call this project is boring. This album, like I said, is all over the place. There's 20 tracks on Quaristice, many of which are much shorter and more concise, and they tonally jump all over the place from moody ambience to lighthearted beat-heavy material to some of the weirdest and most off-putting experimental moments they'd put out up to that point. The downside to that is, of course, that Quaristice is easily the duo's least cohesive project. It doesn't really coalesce together as a complete whole very well. It jumps from idea to idea very quickly, and there's more than a few transitions here that are really abrupt and jarring. But there are also quite a few transitions that do work effectively. It's not the craziest project I've ever heard, exactly. I mean, Quaristice has enough of a feel to it that carries over everything. A kind of atmosphere that drapes over a lot of these tracks and can envelop you even if all of these tracks go about it in very different ways. It kind of has an overarching vibe in the same sense that Aphex Twin's Drux does. Not one that's easy to put into words or describe, but I can still definitely feel in spite of all the tonal and sonic jumps. And probably still more cohesive than that album, too. I mean, all these tracks feel like they came out of the same sonic space. One that generally feels metallic and mildly unnerving. Another thing is that this project also marks a shift in approach for the duo, away from focusing so heavily on the construction of their individual tracks, and kind of basing these tracks more on jam sessions. I suppose in a less serious or involved way as they were doing before, picking out some of their favorite snippets from these sessions and just kind of presenting them as is. I don't know if that necessarily shows in an obvious way. It's not like this project is noticeably less detailed or off the beaten path than previous ones, but at least the fine details in construction are no longer the primary focus. soaking up everything and taking this project's construction super seriously is not likely to further your enjoyment by a lot. Certainly if you go into this and try to digest it in the same way as their last couple of projects, you're likely to just frustrate yourself. And maybe that might have helped in my earlier days of digesting this duo back when I had no idea what to do with projects like Draft and Confield and all those. That did also make it weird to come back to this one now that I do have a much better handle on how I feel on those projects and how to best digest them, because this one has such a different approach. So I needed to readjust a little, but once I did, then it started to really click with me again. Repeat listens and familiarity help a lot, as always, too. The abrupt shifts and weird pacing are less bothersome when you know what's coming, and it is also better the more you pay attention, as usual. But despite how weird this project can get, it actually feels less cerebral than their previous stuff, more able to be taken at face value. And that approach to the music makes it probably a more appealing project to beginner Autechre listeners, which may be part of why it's still one of my personal favorites of theirs. It works for me on a very similar level to something like Boards of Canada's GeoGaddy and its variety of short, seemingly unrelated pieces that do still feel like they're building towards something in a subtle way. No, it's definitely not better than that project, but, you know, it's comparable. Okay, individual tracks. There's obviously a lot to go through. I will say this album's most consistent highlight is also right at the very beginning. The opener, Altibzz, is a beautiful little minimal ambient synth odyssey, strongly going against the feel and approach of their last several albums by featuring some very present melodies and even focusing on them. It's a great little mood piece to kick us off and pull you in right away, a track that I was into on first listen in high school, and still stands out to me now despite its fairly scant length. Though as great an opener as it is not a tone setter. Not that any track on this project could effectively set the tone of the experience you're about to get, but whatever mood kept up by Altibzz is almost completely gone by the second the next track begins. The PLC seemingly sounds much more lighthearted in its opening few seconds, with some sparse little hi-hats and slaps, and this kind of squeaky texture that sounds somewhere between DJ scratching and a bicycle wheel that might need some greasing. Creates a surprisingly foot-tapping beat out of all of it, but even so, these layers of wobbling, dissonant synth melodies are introduced to at least make sure that some of that metallic atmosphere sticks around, and weird sidetracks into experimental textures that crash all over the place and some weird chopped up hip-hop vocal snippets that don't actually say anything. Not a particularly long track, but certainly has a lot going on in spite of that. It is one of the longer tracks on here, at least. And it only gets freakier from there. I.O. has all these deep, demonic-sounding, garbled answering machine voices and synth melodies that sound like they're tumbling down an endless staircase, and in its second half, these tapping percussion textures that bounce all over the place like some crazy ping-pong game, but it transitions seamlessly into Plyphon, with its gurgling synth stabs and massive fuzzy hi-hats and similar textures somehow still building some kind of tangible momentum, and a pulse you can bob your head to. Perlence, meanwhile, is a track that sounds like it's breaking down right in front of you with all these synth melodies that plunk downwards their scale and form dissonant, sour intervals. The first 30 seconds or so are definitely one of the most easily memorable moments on this album. Sticks in your mind, even if that's abandoned fairly quickly for those synth melodies to play at a much jerkier and more irregular pace, and for shuffling, subtle breakbeats struggling to come together in some coherent way but just slipping all over the place and falling over each other instead, like they're walking on a ton of soap bars. There's even some pretty neat acid breakdowns, because why not? And this track also transitions directly into the skittery, glassy textures of Sondirema, which sound like if you submerged a snippet of Vi Skospoise from Confield underwater and it just dissolved and lost its form. It's cool, I guess, just, you know, not one that really sticks out. Thankfully, the next track, Simmm, has some more coherent and even harmonious melodic textures, with its brash, metallic clanging melodies that sound like some kind of synth gamelan, giving me some vague 808 State Outpost transmission vibes, I guess. At least until these melodies get consumed by all these squelching textures that sound like you've just run the whole mix through a barely functional dishwasher. Halfway through, the track becomes much more minimal and stripped back, but still has these subtle but thick ambient pads running through everything and preventing the bleeping mixes from going too far off the rails or becoming too dark or unwelcoming. This is definitely one of the most consistent highlights, and it actually transitions pretty cleanly into the dark ambient groaning and squelchy rainy textures of parallel suns. There's some really cool foreboding atmosphere here. Next up, we got a little experimental sidetrack in the form of Steals, one of the least coherent sounding tracks, as we got all these subtle fluttery textures and robotic servo sound effects that just kind of tap around without forming any sort of pulse, even despite the heartbeat-like bassy kick that can be heard way in the background and atonal acid breakdown that just slams down on the whole mix at one point. I mean, as far as tracks that feel like you're not standing on solid ground go, I've heard more disorienting stuff from them. It blends into the freaky mix of its surrounding tracks, but I wouldn't say this is a moment I ever specifically look forward to. But it does segue into the metallic industrial beats of Tankakern, a more consistent highlight for me. I mean, it sounds like it's coming out of some kind of engine room, with all the metallic humming, fairly coherent pulse and tapping percussion, and other textures that sound like giant machinery moving underneath the floor of a submarine or something. This track, however, gets cut off very abruptly to make way for Rale, another track that has a pretty solid and regular sounding 4/4 groove slowly banging underneath it, while these dark, menacing acid synths squelch away and get covered in reverb for that extra sense of space and distance. That's a pretty consistent highlight as well, despite the non-transition. Unfortunately, then we fall into Full 3, the most incoherent and disorienting track in the bunch that just sounds like 50 wobbling metallic sheets whooshing past each other, occasionally scraping against each other, and there's absolutely no coherent pulse or rhythm. You're just lost in a sea of metallic noise. I mean, I suppose it does sound interesting and it has a sense of space to it, but just like Steals, it's very much another one of those tracks that feels like it gives you no solid ground to stand on and you're just along for the ride as you repeatedly trip and fall on your ass and face. This one also kind of dragged on a bit long for my tastes. 3:47 may not sound like a lot, but it does feel kind of long. It's a long time to go without any structure. We do thankfully come out of that mess to reach FWZE, one of the more lighthearted tracks with a coherent beat that whooshes around playfully despite maybe a sidetrack or 12 into harsh glitching and buzzing. That one's alright. Then there's 90101 5LL, which does have this very thin but crashing beat running through it and very reverb-heavy acid synths all over the place. Admittedly, one of the more forgettable moments on here, even if its groove comes together relatively coherently. And it's cut off by BNC Castl, a track that at first sounds kinda dark with its clacking, themey, Weird Things-esque percussion textures in the first few seconds, but quickly reveals itself to be the most lighthearted track in the bunch, with all these beeping and blooping and clanking textures that are very playful and with very little bass. It's the closest this duo's ever coming to making anything along the lines of Aphex Twin's Logan Rockwich. You'd think this would feel completely out of place, but I don't know, not by as much as you'd think. And I do appreciate it as this fun little breather moment that's no less weird than all its surrounding tracks. But then it eases you out of that by metaphorically walking into that track's basement. The following track, Theswere, sounds like it has sprinklers running all over the place, and has a lot of bassy rumbling to more match the atmosphere of the rest of the album, but still has these playful and charming melodies plunking above it all. One of the more melody-centric tracks in here and forming regular non-dissonant harmonies too. I quite like that one as well, that's a highlight. It is also the last lighthearted moment on the project though, as we go right back into the dissonant freakiness with WNSN. There is a beat with a pulse if you look at it from the right angle, that also becomes more regular and coherent as you go on. And squeaky, groaning, dissonant lead pads that have no right to be as satisfying as they are. I didn't care much for this track at first, but it had a kind of twinge of catchiness in the most left field way, and it is a definite grower. Tank 9 was also a grower in a similar way, delivering some kind of Detroit techno Drexia-esque vibes, with a pretty hard-hitting, if thin, beat, frantic little acid pulses shooting by at high speed and wailing melodies creaking out on top, and later forming more coherent chords. Very retro, old-school sounding stuff, didn't stick out to me much initially, and the whole mix is rather tinny compared to everything else around it, but it gets better every time I put it on. Finally, we close with two straight moody ambient pieces to bookend where we started. No 2 is a lot creepier than our opener, but has a very similar mix. the kind of thing that you maybe could have found on Aphex Twin Selected Ambient Works Volume 2 next to some of those more unnerving spots like tree and grass and all those. There is maybe a little more melody than some of those. And finally we finish with Auth 9X, one more ambient piece that starts out kind of high-pitched and airy like a leaking balloon, but slowly deepens its mix and progresses it, adding subtle bass and plunking textures, and eventually phasing out all these elements in favor of drafty air conditioning pads that are a step away from being like a humming choir or something. Easily the longest track at a little over 7 minutes, but it does make use of that length. And you know, getting straight ambient stuff from these guys is a nice change of pace in general. So, we finally made it through Quaristice. Yeah, still really like the whole thing. I mean, not every moment is as strong or memorable as the next, not every transition is as well executed as the next, some are just really like hard cut abrupt. It's one of those albums where if it does fall flat for you, I will get it. And you wouldn't really expect it to work as well for me, given how it does have a lot of out there moments that feel like you're not standing on solid ground. I've definitely complained about that kind of stuff before on previous albums like Draft 7.30, but it still comes together rather effectively in my eyes, and given how my brain is more wired to appreciate ambient music than most, the more ambient-centric leanings of this project made it stick out all the better. The whole project feels like I'm walking through some giant submarine level in a video game that doesn't have any other people in it, but lots of interesting rooms and machinery to go through, and nothing on here ever reaches outright abrasiveness. It's one of their quietest releases, and I do always enjoy me a turn for the quieter and more subdued. My mind does change on it a lot, and it's certainly not the kind of album that I can just pop on at any time. But I would definitely highlight it as a personal favor from these guys, and one that, like Untilted, I feel is one of their most underrated. Maybe even more so than that one. Definitely worth giving a shot. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.